In just 53 seconds, $74 billion in federal funding hung in the balance. Zohran Mamdani didn't pause to consult advisors. He didn't wait for talking points. He walked to the podium at Brooklyn Borough Hall, adjusted his tie, and delivered a constitutional law masterclass that made President Trump's threat look like amateur hour. What did this 34-year-old Democratic socialist say that forced Fox News to replay the footage for 3 straight hours and made constitutional scholar trend worldwide? November 6, 2025, 8:47 a.m. Eastern. The political earthquake was still reverberating from Mamdani's historic mayoral victory when President Trump fired the first shot. Truth Social lit up with a post that would define the next 4 years of American federalism. If communist candidate Zohran Mamdani wins the election for mayor of New York City, it is highly unlikely that I will be contributing federal funds other than the very minimum as required. The threat was unprecedented. No president in modern history had explicitly threatened to withhold federal funding from the nation's largest city over a Democratic election result. But Trump wasn't finished. Within hours, he escalated on Fox and Friends. This Mamdani character, this 100% communist lunatic, he wants to destroy capitalism in our greatest city. Why should hardworking Americans from Ohio and Texas pay for socialist experiments? The financial stakes were staggering. New York City receives $7.4 billion annually in federal funding. Transportation grants, $2.1 billion. Education programs, $1.8 billion. Housing assistance, $1.3 billion. Healthcare funding, $1.2 billion. Social services, $1 billion. Trump was essentially threatening to cripple services for 8.3 million New Yorkers because they elected a mayor he didn't like. At precisely 11:15 a.m., Mamdani's team called an emergency press conference. No one expected what came next. Brooklyn Borough Hall's steps were packed with reporters, cameras, and curious passers-by. The imposing Greek Revival building, built in 1848, had witnessed countless historic moments, but nothing quite like this. Mamdani emerged from the building's bronze doors, wearing a navy suit, white shirt, and red tie, deliberately presidential colors. His team of constitutional law advisors flanked him, former federal judges, civil rights attorneys, and legal scholars from Columbia and NYU. The mayor-elect approached the cluster of microphones with a manila folder in his left hand and his phone in his right. CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, BBC, Al Jazeera, every major network was broadcasting live. The crowd fell silent as Mamdani set his folder on the podium and looked directly into the cameras. Good morning. Yesterday, President Trump threatened to withhold federal funding from New York City because he disagrees with our Democratic election result. His voice was calm, measured, professorial, no anger, no defensive posturing, just facts. I want to address this threat directly, clearly, and constitutionally. Mamdani opened his folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. Article I, Section 8 of the United States Constitution grants Congress, not the President, the power to appropriate federal funds. The President has no constitutional authority to unilaterally withhold congressional appropriations based on political disagreement. He paused, letting that sink in. Cameras zoomed in on his face. Complete composure. Furthermore, the Supreme Court ruled in South Dakota v. Dole that federal funding conditions must be related to the purpose of the spending program. Punishing a city for electing a Democratic Socialist mayor has no relationship to transportation, education, or housing programs. Legal experts watching live were already texting colleagues. This wasn't campaign rhetoric. This was a constitutional law seminar broadcast to millions. But let me be more specific, Mamdani continued, his voice gaining strength. President Trump claims he will provide only the very minimum as required. Let's examine what federal law actually requires. He pulled out his phone and began reading from prepared notes. The Federal Transit Administration is legally obligated to provide $847 million in already approved subway modernization grants. The Department of Education must distribute $623 million in Title I funding for low-income schools. HUD is required by law to provide $445 million in Section 8 housing vouchers. Each dollar amount landed like a precision strike. Mamdani wasn't just defending his city, he was demonstrating mastery of federal budget law that most members of Congress couldn't match. President Trump cannot arbitrarily cancel these legal obligations without violating federal statutes and his constitutional oath. The mayor-elect's tone remained scholarly, but his message was unmistakable. I know the law better than you do. Then came the moment that would define his entire mayoral term. Mamdani closed his folder, stepped closer to the microphones, and spoke directly to Trump. Mr. President, if you want to have a constitutional crisis over New York City's democratic choice, we're ready. But understand this. You're not just threatening one mayor, you're threatening the foundational principle that federal funds cannot be weaponized against local democracy. The crowd was completely silent. Even seasoned political reporters looked stunned. This 34-year-old had just called out the President of the United States with constitutional precision that legal scholars would later call flawless. New York City contributes $12 billion more to federal taxes than we receive back. We send $30 billion annually to Washington and receive $18 billion in federal spending. President Trump's threat isn't just unconstitutional, it's economically illiterate. The data was devastating. Trump's own Treasury Department confirmed these figures, but Mamdani wasn't finished. He delivered the line that would be replayed millions of times. To President Trump, I say this: constitutional law isn't a real estate negotiation. Federal funding isn't a mob protection racket. And American democracy isn't for sale to the highest bidder or the loudest bully. The applause was immediate and sustained. Not polite political clapping, genuine appreciation for someone standing up to presidential intimidation with legal precision and moral clarity. Social media erupted instantly. Constitutional scholar began trending within minutes. Legal experts across the political spectrum praised Mamdani's constitutional analysis. Even conservative law professors acknowledged the accuracy of his citations. But Trump's response was swift and vicious. At 2:47 p.m., he posted on Truth Social, "Radical Mamdani thinks he can lecture me on the Constitution. He's a communist who hates America. New York will get zero help from real Americans." The escalation was exactly what Mamdani's team had predicted. They'd prepared for Trump's inevitable overreach, and the president delivered perfectly. Within hours, the story shifted from mayor versus president to constitutional scholar versus constitutional ignoramus. MSNBC legal analyst Ari Melber spent 30 minutes breaking down Mamdani's constitutional arguments. CNN's Jeffrey Toobin called it one of the most precise constitutional responses to presidential overreach in recent memory. Even Fox News was struggling. Legal correspondent Jonathan Turley admitted on air, Mamdani's constitutional analysis is accurate. The president cannot unilaterally withhold congressional appropriations based on political disagreement. By evening, the narrative had completely flipped. What started as Trump threatening New York had become Trump embarrassing himself with constitutional illiteracy, while a 34-year-old mayor schooled him on basic civics. The polling numbers were brutal for Trump. A CNN Snap poll showed 67% of Americans believed federal funding shouldn't be tied to election results. Even 34% of Republicans agreed that Trump's threat was inappropriate. Independent voters sided with Mamdani by a 73% margin. Congressional Republicans were privately panicking. Senator Susan Collins called the threat concerning. Senator Lisa Murkowski said federal funding shouldn't be weaponized for political purposes. Even Trump loyalist Senator Lindsey Graham suggested cooler heads should prevail. House Democrats were more direct. Speaker Hakeem Jeffries announced immediate hearings on presidential abuse of federal appropriations. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tweeted, "This is what constitutional leadership looks like." At Zohran Mamdani just gave America a civics lesson. International reaction was swift. The BBC ran the headline, "U.S. Mayor Schools President on Constitution." Deutsche Welle called it American democracy under stress. Even authoritarian regimes couldn't resist mocking Trump's constitutional ignorance. But the real vindication came from an unexpected source, federal judges. On November 8, just 2 days after Mamdani's response, federal district judge Catherine Polk-Fila issued a preliminary injunction in an emergency lawsuit filed by New York City. Her ruling cited Mamdani's constitutional analysis extensively. As Mayor-elect Mamdani correctly noted, presidential authority to withhold congressional appropriations is severely limited. The separation of powers prevents executive retaliation against Democratic election results. The judge's order was devastating. All federal funding to New York City must continue per existing legal obligations. Presidential threats of funding withdrawal based on political disagreement violate both constitutional and statutory law. Trump's lawyers didn't even appeal. They couldn't. Mamdani's constitutional analysis was so precise that any federal court would have reached the same conclusion. The victory was total, but Mamdani remained focused on governing. At his November 10th transition meeting, he outlined his priorities with the same methodical precision he'd shown against Trump. "We proved we can defend our democracy," he told his team. "Now we prove we can deliver for working families." The agenda was ambitious: rent stabilization for 1 million apartments, free bus service citywide, universal childcare for children under 5, and a wealth tax on millionaires to fund it all. Each proposal had been researched,
costed, and prepared for legal challenges. Maria Torres Springer, the former Adams deputy who joined Mamdani's transition, was amazed by the thoroughness. "I've never seen a mayor-elect this prepared for governance," she told reporters. "Every policy has legal backing, fiscal analysis, and implementation timelines." Lina Khan, the former FTC chair, now co-chairing the transition, brought her antitrust expertise to municipal policy. "We're going to show America that progressive governance can be both bold and competent," she declared.
The Trump confrontation had done more than defend New York's budget. It had established Mamdani as a national political figure. Speaking requests poured in from universities, legal associations, and democratic organizations across the country. Harvard Law School invited him to deliver their constitutional law lecture series. Yale's political science department wanted him for their democracy seminar. Even conservative institutions like the Federalist Society expressed interest in his constitutional analysis. But Mamdani stayed focused on New York. "I was elected to serve New Yorkers, not to become a national celebrity," he told his staff. "Our job is proving that democratic socialism can work in America's largest city." The policy rollout began immediately. On November 15th, Mamdani announced his housing team, tenant lawyers, urban planners, and affordable housing advocates. Their mandate was clear: stabilize rents for working families while encouraging new affordable construction. The transportation plan came next: free buses on 6 pilot routes by January 1st, expanding to full citywide coverage by summer 2026. The funding mechanism was elegant: a small congestion fee on luxury vehicles combined with federal transportation grants Trump couldn't legally withhold. Healthcare policy followed: expanding community health centers, negotiating prescription drug prices, and creating a public option for municipal employees that any New Yorker could join. Each announcement was accompanied by detailed legal and fiscal analysis. No sound bites, no empty promises, just competent policy development that impressed even skeptical observers. The New York Times editorial board, initially wary of Mamdani's democratic socialist label, admitted, "Whatever one thinks of his ideology, his governance preparation is remarkably thorough." Wall Street Journal columnist Peggy Noonan wrote, "Mamdani may be wrong about economics, but he's right about constitutional law and impressively serious about governing." Even conservative critics had to acknowledge his competence. National Review's Ramesh Ponnuru noted, "If this is what democratic socialism looks like, constitutional literacy and policy rigor, it's far more challenging to conservative governance than progressive populism." The international attention continued building. European mayors invited Mamdani to speak about urban policy. Canadian officials studied his housing proposals. Progressive politicians worldwide wanted to learn from his constitutional defense strategy. But Trump wasn't finished. On November 20th, he announced plans to deploy federal immigration enforcement in New York as a public safety measure. The threat was clear: if he couldn't cut funding, he'd weaponize ICE. Mamdani's response was swift and precise. Standing in the immigrant-heavy neighborhood of Jackson Heights, Queens, surrounded by families from dozens of countries, he outlined New York's sanctuary city protections. Federal immigration enforcement cannot commandeer local police or require local cooperation. The Supreme Court's anti-commandeering doctrine protects local sovereignty from federal overreach. Again, the constitutional analysis was flawless. Again, legal experts confirmed his accuracy. Again, Trump's threats looked amateurish compared to Mamdani's precision. The ICE threat backfired spectacularly. Immigration advocates rallied behind Mamdani. Faith communities across New York pledged sanctuary support. Even suburban mayors in Westchester and Long Island expressed concern about federal overreach in local law enforcement. Public opinion polls showed 71% of New Yorkers supporting Mamdani's sanctuary city position. More importantly, 58% of Americans outside New York agreed that immigration enforcement shouldn't be weaponized against local democracy. Trump's approval rating in New York dropped to 23%, lower than any president in modern polling. His favorability among college-educated voters nationwide fell by 6 points as his constitutional ignorance became a recurring news story. Republican strategists were privately furious. Trump is making constitutional law professors into Democratic heroes, one GOP consultant told Politico. "We can't win elections by looking stupid about basic civics." The transformation was remarkable. In 3 weeks, Mamdani had evolved from local candidate to national constitutional educator. Law schools assigned his press conferences as study materials. Civics teachers showed his responses to illustrate separation of powers. But the mayor-elect remained grounded in local governance.
On December 1st, he announced his police reform commission. Community leaders, civil rights lawyers, and progressive police commanders committed to reimagining public safety without defunding police departments. The approach was pragmatic and constitutional. Rather than slashing NYPD budgets, Mamdani proposed investing in community safety programs, mental health services, and violence prevention. Crime prevention through social investment, rather than mass incarceration. Police unions were wary but couldn't argue with the constitutional framework. Civil liberties groups appreciated the systematic approach to reform. Even moderate voters supported evidence-based public safety policy over political sloganeering. The housing policy team released their first report on December 5th. Rent stabilization could be implemented within existing state law, affecting 1.2 million apartments without requiring new legislation. The legal analysis was comprehensive, anticipating every possible landlord challenge. Real estate industry lawyers grudgingly admitted the proposal was constitutionally sound. "We disagree with the policy, but the legal framework is solid," one industry attorney told the Wall Street Journal. The free bus pilot program launched ahead of schedule on December 10th. 6 routes in working-class neighborhoods, Queens, the Bronx, Brooklyn, where bus fare represented a significant household expense. The response was immediate and positive. Ridership increased 34% on pilot routes within the first week. Customer satisfaction surveys showed 89% approval. Even conservative media struggled to criticize free transportation for working families during holiday season. The success validated Mamdani's governing philosophy, progressive policy implemented with constitutional precision and fiscal responsibility. No radical slogans, no ideological purity tests, just competent governance serving working people. By December 15th, political observers were reassessing their assumptions about democratic socialism in America. Mamdani wasn't Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's Twitter populism or Bernie Sanders' revolution rhetoric. He was something new, a constitutional scholar implementing progressive policy through existing legal frameworks. Harvard's Kennedy School of Government announced plans to study Mamdani's first year as a case study in progressive governance. The Brookings Institution scheduled a symposium on constitutional progressivism in practice. Even conservative think tanks acknowledged his governance model deserved serious analysis. The Trump confrontation had served its purpose, establishing Mamdani as a serious constitutional thinker capable of standing up to federal bullying. But the real test would be governing America's largest city while navigating federal hostility for the next 4 years. As 2025 drew to a close, the stakes were clear. Mamdani had proven he could defend democracy and articulate constitutional principles under pressure. Now he had to prove that democratic socialism could deliver practical results for 8 million New Yorkers. The mayor who schooled Trump on constitutional law would spend the next 4 years showing America whether progressive governance could work in practice. The whole country, and the world, was watching. Trump's budget threat had backfired completely. What began as presidential intimidation became a constitutional education for millions of Americans. A 34-year-old democratic socialist had outmaneuvered the President of the United States using nothing but legal precision and moral clarity. The lesson was simple but profound. In a democracy governed by law, constitutional knowledge beats authoritarian bluster every single time. Mamdani had proven that competence and principle could triumph over power and intimidation. The revolution Trump feared wasn't coming from the streets or socialist slogans. It was coming from constitutional law, fiscal competence, and a new generation of leaders who understood that democracy's greatest strength isn't its capacity for disruption, it's its commitment to governance under law. On January 1, 2026, Zohran Mamdani would be sworn in as mayor of New York City. The boy who immigrated from Uganda at age 7 would lead America's most important city through its greatest constitutional challenge in generations. Trump's threat had failed. The Constitution had prevailed. And American democracy had found an unlikely champion in a young mayor who proved that the most powerful weapon against authoritarianism isn't anger or resistance, it's knowledge, preparation, and unwavering commitment to the rule of law. The 53-second response that shattered the internet had done more than defend New York's budget. It had restored faith in constitutional democracy and proven that even presidents must answer to the law. What happens when a constitutional scholar becomes mayor of America's largest city while facing federal hostility? The next 4 years would provide the answer. But after Mamdani's masterful handling of Trump's budget threat, millions of Americans felt optimistic about democracy's future for the first time in years. Sometimes the strongest response to authoritarian bullying isn't shouting back. Sometimes it's opening a law book and calmly explaining why democracy matters. Mamdani had done exactly that, and shown the world that constitutional knowledge could still triumph over political intimidation. The budget was saved. The Constitution was defended, and American democracy had gained a champion who proved that expertise, preparation, and moral courage could defeat even presidential bullying. Trump learned a hard lesson: never threaten a constitutional law scholar who's done his homework, especially when 300 million Americans are watching.